Good afternoon, everyone. Strange this. First of all, I'd like to thank Milani for the invitation, Roberta, and all the team for their wonderful organization during these last 3 to 4 days. And it was really a pleasure to meet many of you whom I didn't know previously. The plenary title is South-North, East-West, Local, Global, Can We Talk About Transfer Directions? And I decided to answer to this question in a more theoretical way instead of just talking about South cooperation, which has been for the last 10 years my research subject. My first answer is obviously yes. We need to talk about directions, but not because directions are only a point of origin and a point of destination, but because at the end of the day, directions are metaphors for power relations. But we still need theory to understand these power relations. If I take development cooperation as an empirical object to develop my theoretical argument here, I could understand development cooperation at least in 2 ways. The first way would be to conceptualize development cooperation as a social relationship and try to understand the role of actors in this social relationship in terms of building of discourse, projection of norms, acceptance of values, colonization, and so on and so forth. Domination, oppression, and all that. And also mutual learning, right? The world is not only black and white. It's obviously, there are lots of grays in this continuum between black and white. But development cooperation, since its inception and since its institutionalization as foreign aid in the aftermath of the Second World War, has lived with the historical legacy of colonial periods. That means that development cooperation and foreign aid have always been in the agenda of states' foreign policies. And then that's the second way for you to try to understand and conceptualize development cooperation as an object. And that is very paradoxical because at the same time you have development cooperation and aid as a foreign policy agenda, and then states, they always cooperate with interests. I mean, there's no state, and Brazil is no exception, China is no exception, South Africa is no exception. All states cooperate with interests, and there is a political economy, and there is a domestic politics that both matter enormously in the way that these states are going to project internationally their development cooperation or foreign aid interests. But development cooperation, as I said, is also a social relationship. Then coming to the question of transfer directions, why do they matter? They matter because these agents, be them social actors within development cooperation conceived as a social relationship, be them states, if you talk about development cooperation as a foreign policy agenda and the international politics, these agents behold values, they have power resources, there is lots of asymmetry and lots of hierarchies in this political field of development cooperation. They have different experiences that are always contextually different. And then these transfer directions matter a lot because at the end of the day, contexts matter. Policies suppose, and they also generate, we know that, politics. Secondly, these agents may territorialize their actions, but these territories are plural. We have, for many years, talked about globalization as a process in which territories of flows would surpass and leave behind territories of place, of locus. And we know that this is not true. I mean, within globalization, there are still borders, there are still frontiers. Try to go, as I did a couple of days ago, to Canada through the US, being a Brazilian citizen. And then you'll be immediately, I mean, you have the first barrier, which is a very simple barrier of visas, of control of borders, and so on and so forth. You have resources that are localized. You have, of course, oil, which is one of the most precious geopolitical and geostrategic resources, which is localized. You have gas, you have, I mean, lots of strategic assets which are in a given place. That means that origins and contexts indicate a point of departure, and we may understand north, south, 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 east, south, as in the past, when the Soviet Union or Eastern European countries had also their development cooperation policies projected abroad, as geography, but also as politics. In international relations, very, very briefly, because I don't have that much time to go much deeper into that, we have traditionally used north-south divide as an indicator of a cleavage within international political economy, within international politics, that indicate hierarchies and asymmetries in the international order. But within these debates based on north-south relations, we have never developed theory around that. Perhaps center-periphery would have been a better way to conceptualize north-south relations. But these north-south relations have been very much used in order to signify, to frame the persistence in spite of globalization processes, in spite of the spread of ideas all around the world, in spite of cosmopolitan visions that may exist and common values that do inhabit every human being in the north, in the south, in the east, and in the west. I mean, unfortunately, some are more humans than the others, and this is part of the game. Some are more beholders of universalism than the others. And I think that this is, at the end of the day, what is also written in the issue that you have just shown, which I have read, because the title totally captured my attention when I just saw it published, to imply that, as I said at the beginning, directions can be understood not as concepts, I believe, but as metaphors for these international power relations that coexist with transfers, right? That coexist with policy diffusion. And what we need is to choose, each one of us, in a pluralistic network of researchers, our theories to understand how these diffusions take place within different frames of power. In development cooperation, then the classical experiences that we have had is threefold. Perhaps now we have seen, have started to see the emergence of a fourth one, which is north-south, east-south, historically. But even if it's a historical thing that has kind of disappeared because of the non-existence anymore of the Soviet Union, the Cubans have started to do their international solidarity programs in the field of health and education in the 60s, and they are still doing it, right? They haven't stopped it. And I think that this object of what we now call South-South cooperation, but what the Cubans have traditionally called as international solidarism, is theorized and studied within South-South cooperation research programs. But we have also assisted, as I said, to a fourth modality of cooperation, which is not that new, but it has been framed as something new within development cooperation and aid narratives, which is trilateral or triangular, and there is no consensus in the literature if you should use trilateral or triangular. Some would say that it depends on the governance structure of the mechanisms putting together, say, north donor with a south pivotal state, kind of a middle-income country like Turkey, Brazil, India, or Mexico, or Argentina, which would be able to transfer with the input, financial, normally, input from a donor country of the north, policies and experiences to other developing countries of lower relatively lower development indicator or results, right? 2 more minutes, okay. These 3 or 4 modalities that I have just mentioned, north, south, east, south, 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 and triangular, okay, this doesn't exhaust all the possibilities, right? I mean, I'm just being very brief and trying to make my argument. They present different symbolic, they are different in terms of symbolic regimes, right? I mean, because of history, I mean, North-South will always portray this legacy of colonial times. This is inherent in the North-South experience, which is something that, even though South-South cooperation may reproduce new forms of domination, new forms of dependence, say between China and Mozambique, or even between China and many Latin American countries, because sometimes we talk only about African countries as though the Latin American countries would have been, I mean, autonomous and away from this possibility of structural dependence from China in the new schemes, economic strategic schemes that are being deployed in our region. They are different. I mean, these experiences of South-South cooperation, they are different in terms of the regimes, symbolic regimes that they are building. For example, the non-use of political conditionality in terms of democracy promotion and human rights values. China has other political conditions for cooperation. If you do not recognize a one China policy, for example, then you do not cooperate with China. This doesn't mean, of course, that China doesn't have political conditions to cooperate with other developing countries. But it does not use the same form of political conditionality as traditionally defined in aid and development cooperation literature as the imposition of a political condition related to democracy, democratic governance, and human rights, which is a very well-organized Western hypocrisy. We know that, right? But we can get into the details during the debate if you wish. The same applies to international organizations. I'm getting to my final point. In the sense that very often we talk about global organizations, and I think that yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, you were talking about the global policy network, but it's within OECD. And I think that global organizations may not necessarily be universal organizations, right? And I think that sometimes there is a kind of a semantic sliding from what is global to what covers all the planet and all the nations and societies and thus values within this planet. I mean, OECD in Latin America so far only includes Mexico, Chile, and I think Colombia is a candidate. Brazil is has apparently presented its candidacy, and so has Argentina this year. But you have no African country in OECD. In Asia, you just have Japan and South Korea. I don't know if Singapore is a member of OECD, but it's definitely far, very far from being a truly global organization. But it is conceived as global because it, and then we have to ask ourselves, why this globality of OECD, and how is it conceived, and how do we sustain and support it intellectually, right? Finally, I think that I have been talking about these directions mostly from the point of view of those who are sending. And I think I haven't had, because don't have the time either, to develop and further my argument as far as the lending of using and citing my PhD student, Jordana, right, the lending of this policies. Because I think that where from you analyze, live, experience the results of a policy transfer is also extremely relevant to understand the politics that is underlining and being generated by these policy transfers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think I have to speak up here, yeah.
Yes, Diane, I think, I mean, it's not only possible, but I think it's necessary. And I would say for perhaps three major reasons. The first one is, I think, for what I have read, including your papers and your production about policy transfer, policy diffusion studies, is that this field doesn't have an epistemology of its own. It brings epistemology from other disciplines, just like development studies, right? You can talk to a political scientist, it's going to be something about development. You can talk to a sociology or an anthropology, it's going to be something totally different. And I think that this is something that we share. And I think that this is a wealth, an intellectual wealth that we share and that we can put together. And I totally agree with Alex, people matter, and I think that Osmani is a good film director. You have chosen good actors and actresses that can dialogue respectfully, and this is really important, I think, in a network. Third, I think that the challenge is threefold again. We need to know each other, I mean, fields, I mean, mutual knowledge. Perhaps this is just a guess, because I haven't heard many people from the political transfer, political diffusion studies field talk about development cooperation. I have heard more the researchers and scholars, PhD students who are doing research on development cooperation, getting inputs, insights from your field of analysis. I think that mutual knowledge is important for us to be able to dialogue one to the other. Second, of course, intellectual curiosity, and I think there is no room for doubt that we are all curious intellectually and not only bound by productivity, even though this is important in our institutions, of course, but we are, all of us, I'm sure, much more than that. And third and finally, I promise, I think it's important, apart from different fields of disciplines or interdisciplines put together, I think it's also important to have theoretical pluralism. I'm not an institutionalist, right? But I think I can dialogue and I can learn and generate insights from people who label themselves as institutionalists. And I think that this pluralism is relevant not only in terms of disciplines, but also in terms of theoretical backgrounds and perspectives. That's my point.
Thank you.
I don't know how people who get on stage all the time, they don't fall down because it's really difficult. But anyway, yes, Diane, I think, I mean, it's not only possible, but I think it's necessary. And I would say for perhaps three major reasons. The first one is, I think, for what I have read, including your papers and your production about policy transfer, policy diffusion studies, is that this field doesn't have an epistemology of its own. It brings epistemology from other disciplines, just like development studies, right? You can talk to a political scientist, it's going to be something about development. You can talk to a sociology or an anthropology, it's going to be something totally different. And I think that this is something that we share. And I think that this is a wealth, an intellectual wealth that we share and that we can put together. And I totally agree with Alex, people matter, and I think that Osmani is a good film director. You have chosen good actors and actresses that can dialogue respectfully, and this is really important, I think, in a network. Third, I think that the challenge is threefold again. We need to know each other, feuds, mutual knowledge. Perhaps this is just a guess, because I haven't heard many people from the political transfer, political diffusion studies field talk about development cooperation. I have heard more the researchers and scholars, PhD students who are doing research on development cooperation, getting inputs, insights from your field of analysis. I think that mutual knowledge is important for us to be able to dialogue one to the other. Second, of course, intellectual curiosity, and I think there is no room for doubt that we are all curious intellectually and not only bound by productivity, even though this is important in our institutions, of course, but we are, all of us, I'm sure, much more than that. And third and finally, I promise, I think it's important, apart from different fields of disciplines or interdisciplines put together, I think it's also important to have theoretical pluralism. I'm not an institutionalist, right? But I think I can dialogue and I can learn and generate insights from people who label themselves as institutionalists. And I think that this pluralism is relevant not only in terms of disciplines, but also in terms of theoretical backgrounds and perspectives.